Good evening. Well, it could be afternoon, but I always feel once the clocks go back, it actually feels like evening by 5 o'clock. But anyway, afternoon or evening, to the latest of these talks which Marcus Ramshaw is giving. Having highlighted in some of his earlier lectures specific issues and developments within the town of Beverley, he's now, as it were, taking us through chronologically to show how the impact of wider events impacts on the history of the town through some often very turbulent times. Now, if you happen to believe in reincarnation, which I imagine probably you don't, and ask which century you don't want to come back in English history, probably the one to avoid is the 14th century. It started with famine, and of course, slap bang in the middle, there was the Black Death. And yet, as always in history, received wisdom is often not as accurate as we sometimes think, and reality is more complex. And as Marcus will be showing us this evening, the period which he's covering from the end of the 13th century right through the 14th century is a time both of prosperity but also great trial for the people of Beverley. Just to say that at the end, we always put a collecting plate out. We don't ask any specific fee, but a fiver in there helps us to pay for things like the lighting and everything, and expenses of the duplicating and all that sort of thing. But now, without any further ado from me, I'll hand you over to Marcus.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. We seem to have got that at the right pitch. I'm going to... I've tried to be better with my editing, because I always talk too much, and I always meander and go off-piste onto something completely different about the Middle Ages and have to be brought back to the topic in hand. So I've been really ruthless this time with my talk, and I'm only actually going to talk, the talk itself is only going to be just over half an hour, and as part of that sort of new diligence, I have given you 3 different handouts, because that enables me to keep the word count down, and the handouts I'm hoping you'll take home with you, and you'll read and study them and think about it longer, and you can leave them lying around, so it's good advertising for us. And as for the parish centre and myself have spent so long doing these handouts, I'm obviously assuming you're going to be very generous in your donations to pay for them. But you should have 3 different handouts. 2 are stapled, and 1 is not. And if you don't, then come up here now and get some, because we have 80 of them, and there's plenty around. Well, there should be. So you should have Beverley ordered to build a barge, right? You should also have a table, and you should also have a poem, Western Wind, Where Wilt Thou Blow? Followed by O Fortuna. Yeah. 2. Thank you. There you go. 2 more pounds. Okay. Poem? The barge building. The barge building there. Right. There we go. That one, yes, that one there. Now, also I have an extra treat for you, because obviously this is such a magnificent building. We're delighted to be supported by Dr. Daniela Fountain, who did her PhD at the University of Hull. She's a musicologist on the 16th century in the modern cinema, and she's a guitar teacher as well, and plays the medieval lute, so she has been playing for us throughout these talks. And we'll play it at the end. But also, today, we tried it out this afternoon, you're going to hear, over the Minster's speaker system, hoping this is going to work, O Fortuna from the Carmina Burana by Carl Orff, which I'm sure you'll all know from the Old Spice advert on TV in the early 1980s, or from The Omen, or from Excalibur in about early 1980s. And your first handout, the single handout, is an English translation of the words. Ignore the first poem, Western Wind. Go to the second poem. Oh, how fortune, inopportune, apes the moon's inconstancy. So anyway, now over to the music. It's only about 3 minutes. Wonderful piece of music, incredibly evocative and particularly relevant to tonight's talk, which is called The Wheel of Fortune, Prosperity and Pestilence in Beverley from 1296 to 1415. And I've given you a modern English verse translation of the words you've just heard, which obviously were originally sung in Latin. This is one of my favorite medieval poems, and it demands so much to be read out loud, because the alliteration of it is so incredibly powerful, and it does need to be read dramatically. So you can read along to your handout. Oh, how fortune, inopportune, apes the moon's inconstancy, waxing, waning, losing, gaining, life treats us detestably. First oppressing, then caressing, shifts us like pawns in her play. Destitution, restitution mixes and melts them away. Fate as vicious, as capricious, whirling your merry-go-round, evil doings, worthless wooings, crumble away to the ground. Darkly stealing, unrevealing, working against me you go. For your measure of foul pleasure, I bear my back to your blow. Noble actions, fair transactions, no longer fall to my lot. Powers to make me and then to break me all play their part in your plot. Now seize your time, waste no more time. Pluck these poor strings, then let go. Since the strongest fall the longest, let the world share in my woe. So, written in the 12th century, the Wheel of Fortune was a widespread worldview that medieval society saw as the pattern of daily life. This sinful world was a vale of tears, for which only by God's will, God's grace, and mercy were we protected. Specifically, one might sometimes be rising up the Wheel of Fortune and enjoy prosperity, wealth, health, and happiness, only for one to suddenly slide down it into illness, poverty, and despair. And this merry-go-round continued throughout life, and one would have several highs and several lows on the wheel of life's fortunes. This talk tonight looks at how Beverley reached its zenith during the 14th century, and then slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, began a long decline. And I'm going to argue a couple of new points which haven't been covered by previous historians. Beverley reached its high point in wealth, size, and population during the first half of the 14th century, and not the second half, as most historians have argued. Although the 1377 poll tax, which is frequently cited as when Beverley was the 10th biggest town in all of England, and in fact the second largest town in northern England after the city of York, with 2,663 taxpayers, giving it a population of about 5,500 to 7,000, Beverley was in fact already in decline. It already was going down the wheel of life's fortunes. And it would decline throughout the 1370s and the 1380s and through the 15th century. I will argue that it is between 1306 and 1336 that Beverley reached its so-called golden age, 50 years prior to this. And that during that 30-year period, Beverley even stole a march upon its main rival, not Hull, but the city of York. York, in the early 14th century, is outstripped by Beverley in the number of merchants, the number of trade, the amount of cargo, and its wealth, even though York is 3 times the size of Beverley. However, golden ages seldom stand up to close scrutiny. And for every individual rising on the wheels of life's fortunes would find that some of their immediate neighbors were sliding down it. Now, the 14th century, as Peter points out, and you give a bit of background here, is widely regarded by historians as the worst century to live in during the Middle Ages. It is a century literally stalked by the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: famine, plague, war, and death. Northern England in particular was devastated by continuous Scottish invasions and raids, Beverley itself having to pay £400 in 1322 to ransom itself from being burnt down by Robert the Bruce and his army, who were massed at Market Wheaton on Hunsley Beacon. Beverley, however, is saved. I'll come back to that, because throughout Yorkshire, County Durham, Northumberland, Cumberland and Westmoreland, other towns, villages and manors were not so fortunate, and they were either half burnt down or almost entirely laid waste. And of course this has a knock-on effect, because it affects the income of Beverley Minster and the income of Beverley merchants. And it must have also had an impact on the town's food supply. This was combined with a widespread cattle murrain, which kills off huge amounts of both the cattle, and it extends to sheep, and repeated harvest failures, which are not caused by the marauding Scots, but they're actually caused by climate change, because Northern Europe in the early 14th century is entering what every historian would agree is a mini ice age. But that combined with the degree of destruction of the Scots make this crippling to the north of England. Just to make matters even worse, the period in the 1310s and 1320s is characterized by high winds and tempestuous seas, which actually make fishing even more dangerous than it would have been. By the late 1330s, the 100 Years' War has now begun between England and France, as well as the Scottish Wars. So England finds itself fighting on two fronts, Scotland in the north and France in the south. Edward I also gets involved in a war in Flanders, modern-day Belgium. Then to top all this, in 1348 to 1350, the bubonic plague, in the form of the Black Death, or as it was known at the time, the Great Mortality, would spread. Arriving in York in the late spring, early summer of 1349, wiping out up to half of the entire population of Europe, indeed Christendom. And even in spiritual matters. And it is so important to remember that the Middle Ages is primarily an age of faith. Atheism does not really exist. It hasn't really been invented yet. The late 14th century begins a time of religious confusion and division. As well as the political situation we've got with Edward III trying to seize the crown of France, the papacy from 1305 to 1378 has moved from Rome to Avignon in France and is under the control of the French kings in a period known as the Babylonian captivity of the church. And as England is fighting the French kings throughout most of this period, most Englishmen would have been deeply worried about the fate of their souls and of their loved ones. And things would get worse, because from 1378 to 1415, as Western Christendom enters a period known as the Great Schism, we end up with two rival popes, one in Rome, who's Italian, and one in Avignon, who is French. In an attempt to heal this division, a new compromise pope is elected, but this actually makes matters even worse, because the two original rival popes refuse to acknowledge him. So now there are three popes. There's the Pope, the anti-pope, and the anti-anti-pope. Predictably, nations and states show allegiance to whichever pope suits them for purely political reasons. And of course, this is combined with who they're fighting. So England supports the Roman Pope, and Scotland, and France obviously, support the French popes. So, however you look at it, the 14th century was a really disturbing time to live. And, you know, if you're not got by plague or pestilence, or famine or starvation, or war, and you end up dead, you're not even quite sure if your soul is going to go to heaven or not, because you could be on the wrong side. Now, I'm going to refer to your next handout, which is the table, with my scrawled handwriting there. And this is taken from a book published in 1998, which you can probably buy for a bargain price of about 50 or 60 quid in paperback, by Jenny Commode, Medieval Merchants, York, Beverley and Hull in the later Middle Ages. It's her PhD thesis, I think from the University of Southampton, but it's published in 1998, which makes it quite cutting edge for medieval history. Anything in the last 20, 30 years is really new stuff. There are not many medieval historians around. We're quite a niche bunch, and it takes quite a long time to do stuff like this as well. So here you have a table, table 8.3, the merchants of York, Beverley and Hull and overseas trade by town group. Now, I want to draw your attention to the left there you see 1306 to 1336, A, B, C, D, total. The number of merchants in each category in simple number in York, and again as a percentage, the number of merchants in Beverley, again a simple number and a percentage, and again for Hull. And then compare them to the middle of the table, 1378 to 1408, and then the latter bit of the table, 1460 to 1500. Now, I was stunned when I looked at this table, because it is clear that the success of Beverley and its wealth is in the early 14th century, and it is startling. It is clearly outstripping the city of York, even though that is, as I said, 3 times bigger than Beverley. And even Jenny Commode is quite shocked at this. How is it that Beverley is stealing such a march in comparison to the city of York? She advances 2 reasons which might help explain this astonishing success. I also tend to add and outline a third, somewhat ironic reason. The first reason that Commode argues is that although York and Beverley are both inland ports, Beverley is much nearer the River Humber and the North Sea, and Hull is still establishing itself, and really founded in circa 1299, although I have argued in a previous talk it may well be earlier. But Hull's purpose, largely in this period, is as a military supply port for the English invasions and wars in Scotland. It is not there particularly to engage with trading activities with Europe and the Hanseatic League. The city of York has to transport its wool, and it's all about wool, England's main and most profitable export, all the way down the River Ouse, or down the River Derwent, and then throughout the entire course of the River Humber before it can begin to trade with Europe and the Hanseatic League. So it's partly a geographical reason. And in this 30-year period, Beverley does steal a march. York will catch up, but it's going to take 30 years, if not longer, 40 years. That's nearly 2 generations. The second reason that Commode argues is also a geographical reason, one that benefits Beverley over York, is that Beverley is nestled just on the edges of the Yorkshire wolds, where increasingly large flocks of sheep graze and provides the wool for export. York, by comparison, is in the centre of the Vale of York, which is primarily farming arable land, not pasture land. York is much further away from its sheep flocks, which are either on the North Yorkshire moors or on the Hambleton Hills, around Helmsley, Revo, Ireland, Pickering, etc. So again, it takes longer for the merchants of York to transport their goods, which allows Beverley, for that 30 to 40-year period, to steal a march upon York. So this leads me to a third point I want to add. And again, it refers to the Scottish Wars. From circa 1298 to circa 1330, precisely the period of Beverley's mercantile advantage over York, York, ironically, in some respects, is at the height of its own power and prestige, is at its zenith, because York has effectively become the new capital of England and displaced London. King Edward I and Edward II and Edward III have made it their headquarters to direct the Scottish campaigns, which continue throughout this period, and Parliament itself has been moved from Westminster to York. The Royal Mint and the Royal Exchequer are now both housed in York Minster. The royal family have moved in and taken permanent residence in York's Franciscan Friary on the banks of the River Ouse. However, although this undoubtedly enhances York's prestige and brings an economic cash boost to the city for a nearly 30-year period, it does mean that the entire focus and energy of York citizens is devoted to supporting, funding, and continuing the Scottish wars rather than trading overseas. Whereas Beverley, by comparison, is largely exempt from financing the Scottish wars and even the French wars. In fact, because of the many benefits of St. John of Beverley, all Beverley has to do is to provide 2 chaplains, 2 clergy for Beverley Minster, with the banner of St. John of Beverley to go and lead King Edward's soldiers into battle. And that's it. They don't even have to provide a barge or a crossbowman or a suit of armour. They're exempt from huge amounts of taxes as a result, because this belief in St. John of Beverley is so important and the liberties that Beverley has got. And, in addition to this, because of the generous rights of sanctuary, which have been granted to the town of Beverley, that anybody from anywhere in the country who committed a crime, even murder, even homicidal, deliberate, intentional murder, if they made it to Beverley, they could claim sanctuary, which means a lot to do. And this is a fairly unique right in Beverley's terms about how extensive this is, because it actually includes a 2-mile radius around Beverley. And yet, I suspect, much to the relief of Beverley's town people, since probably at least, if not more than, a third of all the people claiming sanctuary are homicidal murderers. I mean, do you really want them in your town? You know, it makes people protesting against refugees and immigrants looks like, really, you know, you wouldn't have wanted to live in the 14th century. Because homicidal murderers also probably make very good soldiers. So Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III start recruiting them and giving royal pardons to any murderer who's turned up in Beverley, providing they join his army and fight in his campaign in Scotland or in France with a series of conditions. Some get a complete royal pardon, providing they stay in the army for a time period, and then they're released at the king's pleasure. They'll probably have to wait 3 or 6 months. And they will actually get paid and fed as well. Some are expected to go fight, and then they're returned to prison. They must be really, really bad. But anyway, I can imagine that the townspeople of Beverley were probably quite relieved. The vicar himself once asked me that, you know, it's great, this sanctuary thing in some respects. It's fair enough if you're escaping a debt, or you're a petty crime, or somebody's pursuing you in the courts rather unfairly. And there's one tragic incident of a woman from Snave near Howden, a young woman who could have claimed sanctuary in Howden Minster, but instead comes to Beverley Minster because she wants to start a new life, because she's guilty of murdering her child. And it becomes pretty clear that she's either had an abortion or an infanticide because the husband, the father, is not there. There's no mention of him. And here you might see a more merciful act of the sanctuary thing, but that is not true of the murderers. So, in Jenny Commode's handout, I have underlined in the following pages, and this is for you to really read when you get back, those arguments. But look at how wealthy on that table Beverley is in comparison to York. York has a total of 59 merchants, Beverley 77. They're categorized into A, the richest, B, C, D being the poorest. York only has 9 merchants in the A category. Beverley has 24. York has only 12 merchants in the B category. Beverley 22 plus. Sometimes it's hard to tell if because you can occasionally get a merchant who is both from York and from Beverley. So that explains that sort of confusion. But they are the wealthiest, and they are in number. I never, ever expected that. Now, I'm going to move on to a slightly different sort of theory I have, which Peter and I have been debating. We have a different opinion on this. So we've established the fact that Beverley is at its high point in trade and money in this 30-year period. And I suspect it continues even longer, because I don't really think it stops in 1366. In fact, the evidence here is that York only starts to overtake in 1378. So, historians can be a bit lazy at times, and particularly in the Middle Ages, if we can't find a way of explaining something in the 14th century, which is too difficult, then it just has to be the Black Death, doesn't it? Must be. Must be bubonic plague. Has brought about this collapse in society and collapse in everything. It has to be. We've got absolutely no proof necessarily that it is. I mean, clearly the bubonic plague is bad, although it's pretty much bad for everybody. So you think maybe it would affect the level playing field. It has been generally assumed that this magnificent nave of Beverley Minster in which we are sitting was begun in the early 14th century, and that building work ceased as a result of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. But work then resumed to complete the nave in the second half of the 14th century. And that the two western towers and the east window were added in the early 15th century. And certainly they're the only perpendicular parts of the Minster today, the rest of the building being either early English or decorated. Because in the 15th century, Beverley, certainly from 1420, is now really beginning to feel the economic downturn. After the 1420s, so a good 100 years towards the end of the Middle Ages, I'll talk about this in my next talk, money in Beverley is beginning to run out. And even the city of York enters a decline from circa 1450. So even in the late Middle Ages, during the War of the Roses, York is way past its heyday, is now going through a long decline. Beverley is losing out to Kingston upon Hull, because Kingston upon Hull is now placing a stranglehold on Beverley's merchants as an inland port. But this is also the beginning of the emergence and rise of the textile towns of the West Riding of Leeds, Halifax, Dewsbury, Huddersfield, a rise that will become meteoric after the discovery of the New World, the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492. And the American trade will dramatically affect the population of England, as people and trade increasingly move to the west parts of England and abandon the eastern coastline. Now, in some respects, it is fortunate for us today that Beverley did begin to run out of money. It's the truth that when you find wonderful medieval towns and cities, be it York, even be it Canterbury, Chester, other places, Durham, the reason you have those medieval buildings that survive is because the town at some point since the Middle Ages has fallen on hard times. It has become poor because it hasn't demolished and rebuilt all these wonderful old medieval buildings with something which is more fashionable, more up-to-date. And it hasn't become incredibly industrialized and consequently got rid of its past. And this is just as true in church architecture as it is in secular architecture. Because if Beverley had not been running out of money in the early 15th century, we would have probably lost all the early English stuff. We would have probably lost the entire choir and chancel. That would have been rebuilt in a perpendicular style, as it would be in York Minster. And it's quite possible, but I think it's unlikely, that even the nave here would have been demolished and rebuilt in a 15th century style, if the Minster had been able to afford it. Given the astonishing prosperity and wealth of Beverley over that 30-year period in the early 14th century, I suspect there's no reason to assume that prosperity didn't continue until right up until the Black Death in 1349. So actually, I'm extending it now to a 45-year period. And it seems more likely to me, if you had 45 years of tremendous wealth, that would have been enough to complete the entire nave before the Black Death. Surely. Why do we assume? Now, Peter points out there's a crack over the Highgate porch. How did he describe it? and a change in window style. I'm not buying it. But we can discuss that. There'll be a question and answer session at the end. Now, so I am aware that there are some counter-arguments to this, and I'm going to add some more, which actually adds to my rejection of that theory. Because in the 1370s, not only is Beverley now economically falling and declining, being eclipsed by York, and Hull is about to take over, but the town's internal politics are in a turbulent state from 1377 onwards, with both the impact and the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which lingers in Beverley right into the early 1390s, plus a major dispute between the Archbishop of York and the province of canons of Beverley Minster, where most of the Minster clergy go on a clerical strike and are excommunicated for a decade during the 1390s. So I am very doubtful that there was any energy or enthusiasm, or indeed the financial resources for any building work in redoing the nave, which is why the two western towers are not added until funds permit it, and the situation becomes more stable in the early 15th century, which is about the same time as the rebuilding of the town's North Bar and the town's gates in 1409. Now, do challenge me on that. And I'm not belittling the Black Death, because now I'm going to come straight onto that. But it's hard to know with any precision how badly the Black Death affected the town, though it must have been devastating. And urban areas, and in particular ports, must have struggled to find any respite from contagion and infection. Historians previously thought that between a third and 40% of England's population perished during the 1348 to 1350 outbreak. But now most historians think the true figure is closer to 50% and very possibly higher. In addition to the first and worst outbreak, does this remind you of COVID and lockdown? Gosh. There was a second pandemic in 1361 to 1362, a third pandemic in 1368 to 1369, and a fourth pandemic in 1374 to 1375. So do you think the Minster's building of the nave stopped as each pandemic hit? Could it have stopped 4 times? Sorry. Now, it is not clear when the danger of bubonic plague actually finally receded, as it would reappear in the 17th century with the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. And throughout the Tudor period, during the 16th century, records are unclear in the case of plague deaths, whether they were caused by the bubonic plague or the even more deadly Tudor sweating sickness, which could result in a healthy man waking one morning but being dead by sweat and sickness in the evening of the same day. Now, we do certainly know that the East Riding was badly affected, and we do know that Holderness and Mew Abbey were especially hard hit. According to the Chronicle of Mew, the abbot, Hugh, Mew's just up the road, died of the pestilence, and to quote from the Chronicle, when Abbot Hugh had ruled the monastery for 9 years, 11 months and 11 days, at which time there were 42 monks and 7 lay brothers, not counting himself, he died in the great pestilence, along with 32 monks and lay brothers. This pestilence grew so strong in our monastery, as it did in other places, that within the month of August, the abbot, 22 monks, and 6 lay brothers died, of whom the abbot and 5 monks were buried together on one single day. Other deaths followed, so that when the pestilence ceased, only 10 monks and no lay brothers were left alive out of the 50 monks and lay brothers before the pestilence. From this time, the rents and goods of the monastery began to dwindle, largely because the majority of our tenants in their farmlands had also died. And because after the abbot, prior, cellarer, bursar, and other experienced men and officials had died, the survivors made misguided grants of the goods and possessions of the monastery. Mew Abbey, a very large, wealthy abbey, unfortunately there's only earthworks that remain, and maybe the odd of a bit, is Beverley's nearest male monastery, and it has lost 80% of its population. 80% of the population of the monastery, and it's quite clear the majority of its tenants as well, which strongly suggests it's more than 50%. That's astonishing. And it's either that the monastery was just deeply unfortunate, and the wheel of life's fortunes there clearly falling down it, or it may be a testimony to the dedication of the brothers to their pastoral care and work, tending to their tenants in their hospital, in the hospitium, or giving in their confessions, or giving in the last rites, those who had contracted the plague that led to the monks being unusually vulnerable to contagion. I've never come across anywhere with a higher death roll than 80% throughout it. It had been thought that the Black Death had created a fairly level playing field in economic and labour terms, because so very few communities survived it unscathed, but the Mew example clearly belies this. We do have evidences of tax relief and tax returns on communities that get a 30, 40 or 50% relief, which seems to indicate some way of our measuring the death rate during the bubonic plague, but 80% is clearly off the scale. And this is difficult stuff to research because society is in a real collapse during the Black Death. It makes COVID and lockdown look like an absolute picnic. But further research is clearly needed on this. In the most recent research, and this really is recent, the most recent scholarly work is by a woman called Catherine Warner. And this isn't as expensive, it's only £22. So available in all good bookshops, apart from the Minster's bookshop. But Catherine Warner gives an impressive study of the Black Death based on a study of the calendar of the Inquisition's post-mortem in the National Archives. And it was only published this year, 2025. The Black Death in England, Journal of the Plague Years in the 14th Century, and she is a proper historian. And what she tries to do in this wonderful study, and there's a whole 2 chapters on Yorkshire, she goes through not the statistics. She doesn't want to, because, you know, if I say 50% dead, 80% dead, after a while we kind of just switch off, don't we? And it just comes a load of numbers. You know, you've got the point, you know, it's deadly, it's bad. But she tries to save every name she can of every individual, man, woman, boy, girl, child who died, by going through records known as the escheats. The escheat, whenever somebody dies in the Middle Ages, and there are tens of thousands of these documents, the king takes all their land and property back into his ownership and calls, in the nearest town, an inquisition post-mortem, in which people come and give evidence and testify how old the person was when he died, what he owned, who was his heir, was that heir legitimate, and was that heir old enough to inherit? And if they're not old enough, then the estate will be taken into wardship of the king and then granted to them when they are 18. Or they will be disinherited if it's found that they are born illegitimately. And these are incredibly detailed. And as a consequence, we now know people's ages, their names, and we start to work, and frequently there's a reference to Robert Warner of Poppington died of the pestilence. His son, aged 5, also died of the pestilence. The mother also died of the pestilence. We cannot find the heir. So I do encourage you to read through this, because this really tells the story of the Black Death alive in a way I've never seen any other historian do, so convincingly and so personally. And you'll probably see your own villagers appearing in it, and what happened to Margaret and John of Leconfield or Eton, and their fate. So I do commend that to you. We do know that very quickly after the plague arrived in York in May 1349, the Archbishops of York were quickly consecrating new graveyards and burial grounds throughout the diocese, including one in Beverley as early as June, just 1 month after the outbreak had reached the city of York. Archbishop William de la Zouch of York issued a commission to consecrate the churchyard of the chapel of St. Thomas by Beverley. Now, I'm going to ask your help on this, because unfortunately, and I have gone through Pestilence, I've studied map after map after map, and I have been unable to identify this church. So if anyone knows of a St. Thomas's church by or near Beverley, please do let me know. St. Thomas is not a particularly common dedication. There's loads of St. Mary's, there's loads of St. Peter's, there's loads of All Saints. St. Thomas is one more scarce, so I'm surprised I can't find it. And clearly this is going to have a lot of burials in it of plague victims. Now, the main boon or benefit to the people of Beverley in the second half of the 14th century, which are still benefits from today, we're going to go a slightly more cheery topic here. It's, I've been talking for 45 minutes, so I'm on course to finish on time. Is in 1380-81 when Archbishop Alexander Neville granted to the town the entirety of the 600-acre wood known as Beverley Westwood. Concerns about the rights of pasture and frequent complaints, largely arising from the Archbishop of illegal poaching in the Westwood, which had formed part of the Archbishop's deer park, had often been a source of tension and excommunication, was frequently used as a punishment by the Archbishop against poachers. It's a very rare, very uncharacteristic, and a very surprising act of generosity by Archbishop Alexander Neville, who certainly was a nasty man. He's forced the clergy of Beverley Minster into strike for 10 years. He's actually deposed by the Pope and flees off to Scotland, where he tries to set himself up as Archbishop of St. Andrews. Why on earth he's making this generous disposition to Beverley, which is a town he's been at loggerheads with for the past 6 years? Either getting them excommunicated, arrested for poaching in his park, or actually deposing the entire chapter and asserting his rights. I don't know, and I'm still trying to work out what is really going on here. And this is also the time of the Peasants' Revolt. It's the same year. And the Peasants' Revolt in Beverley is particularly violent and vicious and nasty. You know, the town is fined over £1,000, which would be about £10 million in today's money, by Richard II for its rebellion. And I was giving an early talk, the knock-on effects of the Peasants' Revolt in Beverley lead to discord and rioting for the next decade, for 10 years. It is not a happy place. Even, so that wheel of nice fortunes, one person's rioting, another person's making a fortune. In the tray, which we'll come to shortly, in the third handout. And yet, Archbishop Neville, for some reason, has given 600 acres of the Westwood, with all its trees, plus a further 200 acres at Figham, and a further 200 acres at Swinemore, to the people of Beverley in return for a fee of £5 a year, which is about £15,000 in today's money. I mean, that's not even minimum wage, is it? For 1,000 acres of land, of prime woodland, which also, by the way, gives various other rights. The Archbishop retained, there's lots of lime kilns up there for making bricks and making lime and making all sorts of things. The Archbishop retains the right of one lime kiln for himself, but there's this strange clause when he actually, it will just be for myself or for Holgarth, I promise not to sell any of it. Why are you promising not to sell any of it? Is that to make the merchants happy, that they don't have a competitor? because I've got the rest of the lime kilns, you can undercut them. The Archbishop also reserved the right of pannage for himself and his tenants at Bishop Burton, where he has another palace, or hunting lodge or whatever, as well as the one just over there in Hallgarth, opposite the Minster. Pannage was the right to drive tame pigs into the woods in autumn, to fatten on acorns before being slaughtered in the long winter for food. The Westwood provides a regular source of income from the town, as well as a general provision of timber for both building work, shipbuilding, and of course fuel. The felling of the trees in part also provides additional pasture for the freemen of Beverley to graze their cattle and now to put sheep on, which of course is going to be part of those exports to go to the Hanseatic League. Within 5 years, in 1386, 1387, the town is practically turning a profit on this gift. In the town's accounts, in that year, they've received £1 and 4 shillings from the sale of wood, and £3 and 10 shillings from the lime kiln, almost covering the £5 payment. What are they short? They're just short by about 5 shillings already, within 5 years. Right, well, the wheel of life's fortunes. Well, it doesn't bode well for Alexander Neville later on, because he'll be deposed, but we'll come to that in a future talk. And I'm drawing now towards a close. And although you're probably bored of me having said this so many times, but finally, recognition does have to be given to the financial benefits and protection, both directly and indirectly, given by that most overlooked and underappreciated of saints, St. John of Beverley. My talk began in 1296. That was meant to anyway, that was on the posters. When Edward I builds a lavish new chantry and shrine to St. John of Beverley. And it concludes in 1415, when on October the 25th, just last Sunday, I'm disappointed to say we did not celebrate the feast day of the translation of St. John of Beverley, which was just last Sunday, on October the 25th, when King Henry V gives thanks to St. John of Beverley's intercession for his stunning victory at the Battle of Agincourt, and ordering that his feast day be celebrated throughout all of England, and making St. John a patron of the royal household, third only to St. George and St. Edward the Confessor, as well as the royal gifts and pilgrims' offerings, which benefited both the Minster and the town, and ongoing legacies left by testators in their wills to the town's churches, the prestige and fame which the cult of St. John of Beverley cannot be overestimated. Because of respect to the St. Beverley was frequently exempted from military service and duty, and even occasionally from taxation, providing it just sends those 2 priests with the banner of St. John. Now, your last final handout, this actually gets a bit complicated because yes, throughout the 12th and 13th century, Beverley is exempted from having to provide any barge or build a ship for the King's Navy when he's fighting France, or he's fighting Scotland, or he's fighting anywhere else. Every other town is. There's a long list of them. Hull has to provide 2 or 3. And it specifies how many oars there are to me, or whether they're meant to be a ballinger, what type of ship, how large, how many masts. And these are quite big, they're 50, 60, 80, 100 oars for these ships. But in the 1370s, you see on your first bit of that handout, Beverley ordered to build a barge, thereby losing its previous exemptions. November the 30th, 1377, during the reign of Richard II. And as I'm not going to go through these in detail, these are for you to read out when you get. There are a series of other documents which I've translated from the National Archives about Beverley losing these various exemptions and actually be giving a strict order under a pain of £100 with the mayor and bailiffs of Kingston upon Hull together to create a barge. Now, Beverley in the late 14th century is, even though they only have to do one smaller barge with, 40 to 50 oars, whereas Hull has got to do a bigger one. And they're interesting, these documents, because these documents actually, one of them you'll find, specific commands, because the king is now aware himself that Beverley is not as wealthy as it once was, and he insists that payment should be exacted only by the wealthy or those of middling sort because of the poverty being claimed by others. So it's an early reference to the middle classes. We tend not to think about the middle classes in Beverley, but that's the phrase that gets used again and again, people of the middling sort. The third document, you see the huge wealth of Beverley's merchants prior to the Black Death, September the 3rd, 1343. Now, this is a long document about customs and, and trading wool and not paying the right sort of subsidies, the right customs, and actually the merchants lending to the king. But I included it because there's staggering amounts of money here. £562 just from 2 different merchants of Beverley. Now we can multiply that by 2 to 2,500 to get anything close to today's money. So this is millions and millions of pounds which is passing through Beverley just 5 years before the Black Death and nearly 10 years after Jenny Commode's study period, 1306 to 1336, has ended. Now, wherever the citizens of Beverley stood on the wheel of life's fortunes, they always had St. John, who was a constant source of comfort, solace, protection, and survival to the people of Beverley, until King Henry VIII ended it all in 1540. This act, by the most tyrannical of all English kings, would be a body blow, but to an already declining town, and it will lead to a continual decline for the next 2 centuries until the late 18th century, when Beverley would re-establish itself as a social and administrative centre, and in doing so, move towards a second prosperity in the Regency period. And there you go, with 1 minute to spare, therein I end my talk.